Welcome to One Bad Podcast. Here's your hosts, KD and Shaner.
Okay.
Katie, we didn't get to your Scarecrow story on our Scarecrows episode, so kick it off, buddy.
Well, I mean, we shared some great stories. I mean, what I found out just yesterday was kind of crazy. Rock 102 here in town called me, and they're like, "Did you hear the news?" And I was like, "What?" And they're like, basically they just did this poll online with like 1,400 voters, the top 20 songs that Rock 102 plays, and we made the top 20, which is we made number 20, which is as they joked, we're the first in line if you just flip the list upside down. But so we're number 20, and they're like, what song do you guess it is? And for me, it's going to be either Scarecrows or Blues, but I went Scarecrows, and that was right. So it's kind of cool. I mean, the song, we talked about how special it is for us, but obviously there's it really sticks with listeners. It's like their first experience with OBS for most listeners, and there's something about it. I remember people kept messaging and be like, yeah, some people said they kind of heard a bit of a Bon Jovi vibe in your vocal on there, and a bit of Cornell, a little Axl, whatever. But I remember just people being like, what band is this? So that was the song,
That's really cool, man. Well, thanks for sharing, because that's the first I've heard of that. So that's amazing. And it's funny because for a while, I remember, as tours started to kick off and stuff, like bigger tours, like we went out in this era, I think, is when we went out with Glorious Sons and Airborne, and we were the Scarecrow. Yeah, I remember being the Scarecrows band, because we'd play, and then when we'd get to that song, people would be like, "Oh shit, we didn't know you guys were that band," and I was a little. I remember being put off by it, but then I'm like, "Well, no, that's crazy," because that is how you get into music for a lot of people, right? Like they get a song that hooks them, and then they don't even know who it is, because oftentimes they'll miss the name, when it's announced on the radio and stuff.
Well, you were always kind of anti-hit in the early days until you had some hits, and then you became a hit sort of craver,
I was like, I said, I remember I was like, yeah, playing to these people is a lot of fun, playing to full houses is actually a good time, well, it's funny, man, and we say it jokingly, but there's like this love-hate relationship with the radio and even streaming now, right? Because the new thing is like, it's like, oh, you want a playlist? We're trying to get on Spotify playlists like we used to try to get on the radio, in a way. Like and it's tough because, if you're an underground act, you can build, like, I think of a band like the Cancer Bats, they don't get radio. They never have. They have a massive following all over the world, right? And they can tour anytime. And there's something to be said about that, because your career's not contingent on whether or not radio plays a single. And that, as we found out, and as this story goes on, this really started to creep into the band and into our mindset, because we go from playing to nobody. Scarecrows comes out, then you're right, It Ain't Right comes out and does really well, goes top 20. We'll talk about Blues for sure, but we're playing to now packed houses. That's when we made the move from playing Buds in Saskatoon to playing Coors, right? Like that's a jump from 200 people to like 1,100 people, and everything goes up from there. So it's really hard not to get in your head when it comes time for the next single, like, what's it going to be, right? Because you mentioned in the last podcast, all of a sudden it was like, oh, like, shit, what's the follow-up, right? And It Ain't Right and Blues, we knew were great songs. We still didn't get support from the label, but at this point, at least they were like, we have no idea why you're successful. We have no idea why people like Scarecrows, so we'll just defer to your judgment. So it did get easier to at least pick singles, right?
They let us pick the next two. I mean, with a little bit of pushback, but that's what I say to young bands. Like when you have success, it buys you some freedoms, right, in terms of choices, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, they let us pick the next two, which was kind of a bit of a win.
Oh, absolutely. But it did, like, it started getting in our heads. I know you and I have talked about this a lot on the road and otherwise, that it became like you saw how big things could get the bigger your hits could get. And then our next thing was like, well, okay, we got a number 5. It Ain't Right hit 11. Blues went 5 or 6. 6. And we'll get into that, which it's funny in radio. I think it actually had more plays than Scarecrows, but that's the way radio works. It depends who else is out there and how many spins everyone else is getting, right? So,
yeah.
but that was tough, man. And I remember talking to a friend in a band, and they hadn't been on radio yet, and they were like, "Oh, it's great seeing this happen to you guys." And I said to him, I said, I don't, I'd love it if you had big hits on the radio, but I also want you to know that you don't have to do that, and it can start to get dangerous once you start to get mainstream success in that way, because now you're talking to radio people who you and I both know across the country, across the world. They're not all music people. So you're trying to convince non-music people what songs to play, and radio is a whole thing in itself. It's difficult. It's a difficult world. Like, they can only play so many songs. So what are they going to add? Anyway, I don't want to ramble on about it, but it is like the world of, like, once we got that taste of success, like you said, it really changed things. It changed things in my mind. I know it changed things for us. Now you run into that danger of, like, were you going to write for the radio now? Or because to this point, even with Scarecrows, we wrote it because we thought it was a good song, period. We didn't really think about radio as far, except for like how long it was and like things that could get it on radio. But
Sorry, 1 second.
It's real-time technical difficulties, Katie. Anyway, we got a lot to talk about, especially with the Red album, because it really did kick things off for us. But it was where we started the podcast talking about our 2018 tour and just how worn out we were by that point. There's kind of this thing that happened when Scarecrows came out, which was like playing to more people, doing more stuff, finally getting some success in our career. But also it was the beginning of this sort of dark, like I don't know if this sounds too heavy, but it was like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you felt this way. It was like a darkness creeping in, though. This like monkey started to get on our back of like what you need to do to keep the success going.
Yeah, well, and again, I think that's why I always have a soft spot for Scarecrows, because like you said, we didn't write it to become a radio hit, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that whole record, we wanted to write stuff that was catchy. We were trying to reach millions of people. I mean,
yeah.
I think with
we
voice,
did
like,
want radio for sure, but it was like,
And then you're right. So once that happens, then it's like, of course, where is Scarecrows 2? We should have named the follow-up record that. No, but we really tried to not do that, right? We see where the songs come from, try to make them catchy, but it's always in the back of your mind, right? And that's the whole thing. It's like, and I think we did a pretty good job of this, is just writing songs. Don't let the commercial aspect of it creep in till the songs are done. You know what I mean? Like, write a song to its fruition, see whatever magic is floating around in the ether, which I always think our job is just to pull it down. And then, and once it's all done, once the paint is on the wall, then you say, which one of these is a hit? Which one of these is a Picasso, But like you said, and we'll get into that later with that, I guess, which is our last record now, our last release in 2017 or 18.
17, 18.
Yeah. Like at that point, I think we were just trying to, we'd had some hits. We had a number one even, and it didn't really change. Like, it's not like we all of a sudden had a bunch of money or anything like that. Like, it didn't really change our lives. So I think we realized what it means to have a hit in Canada. And it was hard because we realized we couldn't make a living off it, and unless you're on the road 11 months of the year, which is hard. But yeah, I think you're right. It sort of crept in. And, but let's also, I want to talk a bit too about, so the Red album, we haven't really talked a ton about, right? I mean, I think, so It Ain't Right, second single. I remember it was like, well, it still is one of our fan favorites, I think, right? I mean,
huge, yeah.
I still love it. I love some of your best lyrics, and the lyrics actually seem to resonate even more now than they did back then, which is awesome.
Yeah, I know it's odd, but 100%. And I mean, your work on it too. That's your music, that piece, right? Like, so that was cool because that's a piece of music you brought in.
Oh, right, yeah, I forgot about that.
It's funny the things you remember and forget, but that was your music, and it also just like it was hooky right off the hop.
Yeah, and again, it was too sort of political was the idea, right? It's like, you don't want to be a political band. Like, leave the politics to Rage Against the Machine. They're the one band that can have politics, but not One Bad Son. We're like, fuck that. Like, this is just a great song. Again, it's a song that we believe in, and so we had to sort of. And at the end of the day, we just basically said, "Hey, Scarecrows worked, so let us release this." And it would have gone top. The quick side story, which is kind of funny, it would have gone top 10, but remember, so many stations, and it's worse now, but they got sort of disqualified from being a counting station because they played too much classic rock. So in other words,
Yeah.
if you don't play enough new rock, the spins that you do play don't count towards. You're not a modern rock station. You're a classic rock station. So a bunch of the stations that loved us and got us to number 5 with Scarecrows played too many Jesse's Girl, and then now they don't. Now those spins for us don't count because they're not a counting station. So it stalled at number 11. It should have been our second top 10, but it got stuck at 11 because the Calgary station, I won't say it, was now for that period was a classic rock station.
Yeah. And that, man, I'm glad you brought that up. I actually kind of forgot about that. And I remember that It Ain't Right it had very close to the same spin count as Scarecrows, however many spins. I guess we should break this down quick because there's probably a lot of people that don't know how this works. We won't get in crazy depth about it, but it's like you get spun so many times a week. So, and based on how many times literally they play the song on each station, that's your chart for that week, right? But you have to be a counting station, like you said. And usually smaller radio stations, like take Grand Prairie, for example, they play the shit out of us still, but they've never been a counting station because you got to pay extra money for that. It's a whole other thing. So we could get played 800 times a day in Grand Prairie and it doesn't count towards our chart position. And we had a lot of non-counting stations, which was great because we had amazing crowds and played awesome shows and still do. But a lot of people don't understand that. Like they will hear us on their local station and wonder why the song's not charting higher. But it's because there's so many things like that behind the scenes that like this podcast could go deep into the weeds where Eddie Vedder lives, waiting for Cornell to call him out. But that's part of the deal. There's all those things that we didn't know about that, right? Like you just think radio's playing you like that, we're charting, but like, no, you're not charting. Only these stations count. And the big city stations are the tough ones to get usually. And, so It Ain't Right. You're right. Like coming back to that song, I loved it. You know, I was in a pretty political headspace. I think you start to realize it's kind of volatile, and you also kind of don't want to always divide your fans. I think I started to realize you want to unite people through music, unless you are rage and you're just like, this is the message. Plus that song, I will say, it wasn't a left or right stance, and it's crazy the way the world's gone to like, you're on this team or you're on that team.
Right.
And that's what the song was about. It's like, in a nutshell, It Ain't Right is about like, why do people line up behind their billionaire of choice? You know what I mean? And it's like, stop doing that. Like you're cheering for which billionaire, you're going to side with. Like, doesn't matter what political figure it is. It's like they're in a different world than you. So just like pay attention to you, be good to your neighbor, and it was about that. But people, as we found out, depending on what part of the world you're playing in, they would take that song in very different ways, right?
Well, yeah, to me, it's more classist, right? Like it's the rich against the poor, which to me, that
100%.
speaks to my worldview, which is the world is run by 5 families that are incredibly wealthy, And the left to right doesn't matter as much to me as rich to poor, right? I love that. And
well, because I told somebody recently, I said, do you realize that no matter what you do and how much you yell at your neighbor, like any political figure that's running the world right now, they will remain incredibly wealthy. Whether they win the next election or not, they're going to be okay, but you won't. You know what I mean? And people, anyway, so it was cool that we got that one in there, and it has been like a staple of our set since then. And every time we play it live, it goes over crazy. So I'm really proud of that song, honestly. And I think sometimes It Ain't Right gets a little overlooked because the other songs charted a bit higher. But it's still one of my all-time favorites. Absolutely.
How much time?
And then there's that. Oh, we have. Well, actually, you know what? This is perfect because just like Scarecrows kind of had its own episode, we'll devote a good amount of time to the next single, which also became a crazy hit for us. And still, there is no song that we play live that gets a bigger reaction every time the guitar line kicks off, and that's Retribution Blues. So I say. Like we're like a minute early here, Katie. Unless you have any other thoughts on this, we could cut this one off and just we can jump into the next one. Let's about blues.
Yeah. Let's do it, buddy.
Okay, Retribution Blues next time, Katie.
Nice.
Thanks for listening to One Bad Podcast.